Hello, everyone. We are back again for a new series of Call My Supervisor, the PhD podcast for the School of Politics and Economics at King's College London. Would you believe they've let us do it all again for a third time? You know the format by now, but for those who are new, in this series we'll be speaking to doctoral candidates from one of our departments to pick their brains about all things PhD, from their research and ideas to their revelations and advice. My name is Daniel Mansfield, and I'm the Communications Officer for the School of Politics Economics. And I'm joined today by my co-host, Miguel Castro, an undergraduate studying in the Department of Political Economy. Hi, Miguel.
Hi, good morning.
And with that, it's my pleasure to introduce our guest for this episode, Richard Power Sayeed, a doctoral candidate studying with the Department of Political Economy. Richard, how are you?
Very well, thank you. Really happy to be here.
Good stuff. So let's make a start, and I'm going to hand over to Miguel.
Hi, Richard. So could you please introduce your research to us? A little brief overview and the title?
Yeah, absolutely. The title is fairly bland. It's Energy Policymakers' Motivations Under New Labour. So pretty bland, but I think there's something interesting in there, hopefully. The way I introduce it normally is I say to people, you are familiar with two really major events in British politics, economics, society that have taken place over the last couple of decades. And one of them is the energy transition, this very slow movement towards having cleaner, greener energy in the UK, which has got a bit faster in recent years, but has never been very fast. And then the other process, the other event that I'm talking about is the shift to a more interventionist economy. You know, people are very familiar with the idea that under Margaret Thatcher and still under early Tony Blair, we had a more kind of laissez-faire, some people would say neoliberal economic structure in this country and around the world. But then in recent years, particularly people say since 2008 and the financial crisis, the government has got more and more involved in the economy, making decisions that for a long time had been left to what we sometimes call markets or free markets. And there are two very separate academic literatures about why these events have taken place. The energy transition on the one hand, and the shift to interventionism across the economy on the other. Different literatures come to like really different answers, right, about why these events happened. For the energy transition, the thing that people generally say is that there were increased concerns about energy security in the UK. For a while, the UK had produced a lot of its own energy because we had North Sea oil and gas to rely on. And that didn't mean we didn't buy any energy from others, but we were a net exporter rather than a net importer. And at roughly the same time that we were producing less oil and gas because it was becoming too expensive, because it was all too deep underground, at roughly the same time, China started consuming far more oil in particular. And so there were more concerns about where we were going to get oil and gas and energy generally from and how much it was going to cost us. And then at the same time, and this is all in the mid-2000s, and then at the same time in the mid-2000s, there was an increasingly accepted scientific consensus, not only that climate change was caused by human activities, particularly carbon dioxide, but also that this was a really urgent problem and that needed to be dealt with very quickly. So that's kind of why the energy transition happened, according to like the academic consensus, but also, you know, I think that's kind of roughly the story that you'd read in a newspaper or in a documentary. And then there's another story about the financial crisis, which is that there was this terrible, slightly confusing financial crisis that happened around the world, and maybe it was because of deregulation, or maybe it was because of other things, but it happened, and that forced governments around the world, including the UK government, to start intervening far more in the economy, and they hadn't previously done so. And okay, yes, we had, for instance, David Cameron's government, which in some senses shrunk the state. That looks like it's a less interventionist government. But at the same time, you had the Bank of England doing enormous intervention in the economy through what's called quantitative easing. And then subsequent to that, under the premierships of Theresa May and Boris Johnson, you saw an enormous shift towards industrial strategy, towards intervening in the economy through levelling up. And now, of course, under Keir Starmer and Rachel Reeves, that seems to be a process, a pattern which is only increasing. So rather a long description there of kind of what what other people are saying. Now switching to what I'm saying, which is that I noticed that these two very separate stories have a bit of a coincidence in them, right? Because on the one hand, we're saying that we started intervening in our energy sector in this country in the mid-2000s. So that's the lead up to the 2008 Climate Change Act, which took a couple of years. And then on the other hand, we're saying that we started becoming a more interventionist country, a more interventionist government after the 2008 financial crisis. Like, doesn't that seem like a bit of a coincidence? How could it be that we started intervening in the energy sector, or we started thinking about intervening significantly in the energy sector before this big event, the financial crisis, which is supposed to have precipitated the long shift to interventionism that we have seen since then? So that's an incoherence in these two academic stories that we hear about, these two key events. In order to explain that coincidence, to start telling these two stories together, I'm looking at the motivations behind what policymakers were doing during the New Labour years. So that's 1997 to 2010. And what I'm hoping to find is an explanation for the energy transition and the energy transition beginning in the mid-2000s to late 2000s that correlates or kind of explains that broader shift to interventionism too. You know, were policymakers who wanted the energy transition to happen and wanted to intervene in the energy sector more, were they partly motivated actually by a broad, let's say, social democratic or statist set of ideas, which then also motivated that broader shift towards interventionism? That would be an explanation on the basis of political and economic ideas. Or do we need to be looking more broadly at the kind of material and geopolitical context? Is it that the broad shift to interventionism that we've seen over the last couple of decades wasn't precipitated by the financial crisis? Had it actually begun before? And does it have the same kinds of explanations that the shift to interventionism through the energy transition has? So, I'm that's a very, very big global story, but I'm going to try to tell a more specific UK version of it, focused on what policymakers in Whitehall in the 2000s were thinking.
So, following this very comprehensive and detailed explanation of your research, which sounds very interesting, why have these subjects and these topics of energy transition and interventionist economy have interested you? And could you tell us a little bit more about your interests in that area and how it came along with this PhD?
Yeah, absolutely. So I mean, I did a thing when I was deciding what to do for my PhD, which really involved making a Venn diagram of my different interests. And what was in the middle. So I have been involved in climate campaigning, specifically on energy, but more broadly about awareness of and responsiveness to climate change for a long time. I mean, I guess in a way I've been involved in that since I was a young teenager, but I particularly got involved with climate activism when I was in my early 20s, when I was just leaving university. And then I had an academic interest in New Labour. So that's Tony Blair and Gordon Brown's premierships, 97 to 2010 here in the UK, since I was an undergrad. But then in 2017, I published a book. Well, I didn't publish it. A publisher called Zed published it, but I wrote a book about the culture and the politics of the UK in the late 90s, but it's thinking about how New Labour related to that. So it's the stories of the Stephen Lawrence inquiry, the death of Princess Diana, Brit art, Britpop, and it's thinking about how did these moments that in some ways were moments of real kind of cultural optimism in the UK, how did they relate to that very optimistic New Labour liberalism of the late 90s? And how did the disappointment of that liberalism, the failure of it to create a more equal and a freer, more liberated society, how did that disappointment perhaps translate into a lot of the anger and a lot of the frustration that we're seeing in British society, British culture, British politics today? And then I suppose more broadly, I worked the Labour Party for a while, so Labour Party politics broadly interests me a lot, and it might be a bit obvious, but I'm quite interested in political economy. I'm quite interested in the structure of the state and its relation to the economy. And I guess, I'm 36. I grew up at a time of what looked like enormous political stability. And a lot of people, I was definitely one of them, thought that stability probably couldn't last and was a bit of a mirage. But certainly we were always being told that free markets and the small state were a kind of final answer to how you structure economies and society. And for me, understanding how and why we are quite rapidly moving into a much more statist, much more interventionist relationship between state and economy, understanding why that's happening is incredibly important, and understanding what its relationship to things like social democracy and egalitarianism are, because we used to be told that kind of there was this very close relationship between a more interventionist state and a more egalitarian one, a state that intervened in order to make things fairer. But if we look at economies around the world, and I think perhaps if we look at the UK, I'm not sure, we can see that a lot of interventionism is not actually about making the economy fairer. It's just about propping up markets. It's just about keeping business going. So that question of like, what is the political implication of the state being more involved in the economy? What's its implication for who has power in society? That for me is as big a question for our futures as whether or not we're going to prevent climate change. I think those two things will define our lifetimes.
In previous interviews that we've done in this series, we've spoken about sort of the research methods used, and some people do desk-based, some people trawl data, some people learn to code, others do interviews. Is yours a mixed methods? Do you rely on one method in particular? Is it all about interviews for you?
So I'm a bit of a weird person in our department because most people are economists or political scientists or econometricists or something like that. And I'm a historian. I'm a little bit free and easy with my methods. So I'm doing archive research. I'm literally sitting there at the National Archives in Kew, flicking through big folders of papers from the cabinet, from Downing Street, from departments, trying to find information that tells me what policymakers were thinking at the time. And the kinds of questions I'm asking myself are, were they as interested in any? There are some people who say that policymakers weren't interested in energy security until there was, in 2006, a big crisis in gas supply to Europe. It didn't actually decrease, but there was a lot of worries about it because of this big rivalry between Russia and Ukraine. Sounds familiar, right? But this is all back in 2006. And there's this kind of idea that maybe that was the moment when suddenly policymakers started being worried about energy security, and then this precipitated the 2008 Climate Change Act. But actually, I'm finding that even if policymakers weren't and politicians weren't publicly talking about great concerns about energy security, actually behind the scenes, they were talking about it in an enormous amount. And then you can potentially relate this to things like the decision to go to war in Iraq, right? Which definitely seems to have been linked to the desire to access Iraqi oil. So, I'm doing a funny thing there where on the one hand, I'm defending New Labour by saying, no, they were concerned about energy security. They just weren't talking about it publicly. And then on the other hand, I'm saying the war in Iraq does seem to have been motivated by access to oil. So perhaps what you can hear there is that I'm, as a historian, using fairly recently available archive materials. And that's one of the things that distinguishes me from the political science literature that exists on this subject already. That was done by political scientists who did interviews with policymakers, which I'm also going to be doing. They didn't have access to the kinds of archives that I'm looking at because they weren't available already. But another thing that is perhaps different is that whilst political scientists generally are not very interested in the feelings and the ideas perhaps of individual policymakers, they're more interested in kind of institutions and structural factors in change. As a historian, I feel totally comfortable exploring those more subjective phenomena. And I guess you could say that historians doing that, we're taking a risk, right? We're dealing with phenomena, individual thoughts and feelings, which are far more intangible. We're taking a kind of methodological and an empirical risk because we're going to produce results that, might be less falsifiable, might be less reproducible even. But what I would say is that if you don't take that risk, then you're not allowing yourself to look as a scholar at whole chunks of human experience. And what that results in ultimately is potentially incorrect conclusions if you're not willing to look at those different elements of human experience. So, for instance, political scientists who've looked at this area in the past, they've looked at, say, a bunch of officials who worked in energy regulators. So that's like government regulators of the energy sector here in the UK in the late 90s. And they've said, look at how these people were very committed to free market ideas. This is evidence that there was a strong belief against interventionism in the energy sector. And that's why the government didn't intervene in the energy sector. But by paying attention to what different individuals, policymakers, political actors are thinking and feeling, I'm starting to find a lot of evidence that whilst you had some people who had those very free market ideas, there were lots of others who were really interested in intervening in the energy sector and believed in it very strongly. And I think that's an explanation for why later on interventionism in the energy sector and therefore the energy transition really increased.
Quick follow-up from me, Richard, on the archives there. What's it like sitting in queue, sifting through these papers? Like, are you doing it for hours on end? Do you make notes? Does it give you like a headache just staring at page after page of stuff? What's that like?
Oh, I do a very sort of self-punishing routine of taking a stack of like 200 sheets of paper and photographing every single one just over and over and over and over and over. And then later on, I'll collate that into a PDF and then I'll read through it. And the reason for that is that it means that I don't have to go to queue every day of my life. Instead, I can just go there every now and again and do a load of photographing at the same time. And you were asking me about methods, so I should probably explain that I think I mentioned I was doing a bit of interviewing. Interviewing will be a very big part of my PhD, and I'm kind of talking already, of course, to people who were working at Downing Street under Tony Blair and Gordon Brown, and also to Whitehall civil servants. I'll be talking to some of the more kind of political and campaign officials as well. And there might be a bit of talking to the environmental and the business lobbyists too. And the kinds of interviews I will be doing will be what we call oral history interviews. So again, I talked earlier about how political scientists have one way of doing things and historians have another. With interview methods, oral historians are very interested in allowing an interviewee to tell their own story, to find out what are the ideas and the categories and the concepts that interviewee believes in, rather than sort of what a political scientist might do, which is still really important, is having like a hypothesis, which is based upon a particular theory and involves particular concepts, and which you then sort of ask the interviewee questions which are related to that, and you sort of try to prove or disprove your hypothesis. With me, it's trying to let them tell their own story, and then, we'll see how that fits in with some of the ideas I've had from my reading and my archive research.
So following this, it seems like you have huge amounts of data and data analysis to run through in interviews and a variety of methods that you just described. How far along are you, and how long are you estimating that this will take to complete this whole project?
Well, that is an absolutely horrible question, and you must surely know that everybody hates being asked it. I sort of have no idea, and I sort of am just saying to myself, I am going to finish this within 3 years. We'll see. Maybe that's too optimistic. I'm very lucky that I'm coming to this PhD after having already written a book, having worked in different professional environments as a journalist and as a communication studies official for quite a while. So I think I find it easier to do this work faster, to be honest, than if I was coming straight out of my master's or something like that. But, we'll see. Ask me in a year and a half if I'm anywhere near finishing. Maybe I'll be sobbing into my laptop.
What's surprised you about your work so far, Richard, in terms of what you've found or some avenues you've explored you didn't think you'd be going down?
So in terms of kind of like the rough subject matter, I think that I've ended up kind of where I expected, but there have been particular findings which, maybe my supervisors would say, oh, you're not supposed to tell them to a podcast. It should only be revealed in an academic paper or something. But I'm going to tell you anyway, because I'm kind of excited by them. One thing that I've found that I'm really excited by, and I think would probably produce a good journal article, is how I was talking earlier about the war in Iraq, for the US-led invasion of Iraq in 2003, which the UK under Tony Blair was a very active supporter of, and which, was very widely considered to be an illegal invasion in the UK and around the world. And it was also very widely believed to be motivated by the US, the UK, and indeed other countries like France who didn't support the war, wanting access to Iraqi oil. The kind of story of that is often that the UK wanted access to Iraqi oil. But what I found is that you can trace that concern back in the Downing Street files quite far, to an event which is not often connected to the war in Iraq by historians. So in the year 2000, there were fuel protests here in the UK. And basically taxes on petrol, on diesel, were pretty high. And the people who depended most upon access to petrol and diesel for their jobs, so that's like truckers who transport things around the country, but also farmers protesting. Yes, indeed, it's happening again right now. These people decided to protest against high taxes on petrol and diesel by blockading oil refineries. So they literally started parking their vehicle in front of those refineries, or they started picketing them in a way that actually did quite scare the other truckers whose job it was to transport oil or petrol and diesel out of refineries to petrol pump stations. And these protests very quickly became very, very concerning for the government, because you were seeing panic buying at petrol stations. You were seeing petrol stations having to close temporarily because they didn't have any supplies. And of course, if people can't drive their cars, their vans, their lorries, then very quickly you stop getting food on the aisles in supermarkets. The NHS can't do lots of the really key work that it needs to take care of people with health problems. And indeed, like, people can't drive to work, stuff like that. So there were these very politically difficult protests that were very quickly looking like they were going to have an enormous impact on British healthcare, the economy, British society. It was a real crisis for Tony Blair. And eventually they sorted it out. The government made a bit of a compromise. They also got the police and the army a bit involved. The protests ended. But in the process, Tony Blair had started receiving these briefings on petrol prices, which I'm sure he was interested in before. But the point was, he was now getting a weekly piece of paper in his red box. This is the kind of red leather suitcase that all government ministers have, which have all their papers in them. He was getting this briefing from his officials once a week, telling him what was happening with petrol prices, and also how that was impacted by OPEC. OPEC is the oil producers' cartel. So that's in the year 2000. And what you can do is you can look at every single week, every single time Tony Blair gets one of these briefings on oil prices, and you see this really interesting thing where at first he starts to say, in his marginal notes, right? He's writing in a biro or a sometimes nice fountain pen his thoughts about these briefings, so that his officials can read them and then respond to them. And at first he's saying, "What are we doing about the petrol prices? Why can't we get the petrol companies to decrease their prices?" And his officials come back to him and you say, "Well, actually, the petrol companies here in the UK have got very low margins. They make very little profit on every single litre or gallon or whatever it was of petrol that they're selling. So can't do very much about it." And then after a while, the kind of tone or the subject matter of Tony Blair's marginal notes on these briefings changes. And on the marginal notes on these briefings in the kind of, let's say in 2001, 2002, he starts talking about OPEC. What can we do to influence OPEC? What can we do to get them to increase production so that prices fall? And the officials are saying to him, sorry, Prime Minister, but actually there's very little that we can do because, OPEC's a cartel and they're kind of in control, and they've said that this is the price that they want oil to be at. And, historically, it's not that high, really. And Blair gets more and more concerned about OPEC, and they go back and forth. And at one point, even Jeremy Haywood, his very famous cabinet secretary, so that's the most famous, the most powerful senior civil servant here in the UK. He even commissions a report on could we and should we break OPEC. And I think that he does this because he knows that the answer is we shouldn't try to break OPEC because it would create geopolitical instability. But he does this so that Tony Blair has to look at the report, and Tony Blair will be confronted by the impossibility of actually changing OPEC policy and the impossibility of actually reducing oil prices. And he'll be confronted by that because he'll have been given such an extreme scenario. And indeed, Tony Blair's response in the marginal notes is, this is ridiculous. I didn't want this. What are you talking about? But then, in very late 2002, really quite a remarkable thing, you find stapled to one of these briefings, one of these regular briefings on oil prices and how OPEC's decisions are impacting them, you find stapled to it a photocopy of an article from The Economist, a long article from The Economist about whether or not a US invasion of Iraq could have a positive impact on oil prices, whether it could reduce them. And The Economist basically says, well, not at first, but after a while, yes, invading Iraq would reduce oil prices. Quite extraordinary, I think, to see such a direct link in British government officials' thinking between the invasion and the outcomes of oil prices that they want. It's not a smoking gun, it's not proof that that was what motivated the decision to support the US-led invasion of Iraq, but it is another little bit of evidence. And indeed, we know that around this time, a bit later, a bit closer to the invasion, which happened in the spring, in the UK springtime of 2003, British ministers met with British oil companies to discuss how they could ensure that a US invasion of Iraq resulted in British oil companies having access to Iraqi oil. So yeah, that's my that paper trail. Just looking at this very specific weekly briefing on oil prices over 3 years, that paper trail is a nice nugget, which, obviously it relates to this ongoing debate about how much oil motivated the invasion of Iraq. But for my PhD, it's really clear evidence that New Labour was very concerned about energy security. And actually, they were really willing to do a lot of policy intervention and spend a lot of money for the sake of energy security. It's just that they did it through foreign military intervention rather than, at this point, intervening in the UK's domestic energy sector. That took several years more.
That is a fascinating note on which to wrap up part one. We're going to take a short break, and when we come back, we're going to pick up again on Richard's personal experience of his PhD. We'll see you again in a minute. And welcome back, everybody, to the second part of the Call My Supervisor podcast. In the first half, we spoke to Richard about the content of his PhD and his research. And in this second half, we're going to be picking up with him about his personal experience of being a PhD student, which note I'm going to hand over to Miguel.
So, what has attracted you to take on this challenge and this PhD?
The honest answer is that I always thought I would eventually do a PhD, but it never seemed like the right time. I was a journalist, right? I was a TV producer and also a writer, as I said. In TV, I did quite a lot of different jobs, but I eventually ended up helping to make, as a producer and assistant producer, current affairs documentaries. So, it was often really serious investigations, often on political subjects, because that's what I specialized in. But kind of the importance of television and kind of mass media on the one hand, because you're speaking to so many people, is balanced out by something really frustrating, which is how simplistic it often has to be. And that's both because you're kind of fitting everything into, let's say, a half-hour program, but also because you're making content for people who are, perhaps like feeding the kids their dinner at the same time as watching TV, or they're doing the ironing, or they're chatting, or they're on their phone. And also, of course, you're making programs for people who are not specialists in a subject, right? They are people who may never have studied politics, or perhaps not thought very much about politics, and definitely don't have a kind of a really detailed knowledge base. So the kind of really great stuff about that kind of journalism is really balanced out by a lot of negatives. And going back to academia for me was really about saying, I've learned loads of skills, which I'm really proud of, about how to speak to a mass audience about politics, something I think is very important. But now I want to exercise the muscles in my brain. Muscles in my brain, that's very unscientific. Exercise the bit of my brain which is more focused on the detail, on the nuance, on the kind of high level knowledge and the specialist ideas, which you only can do really in an academic context. And also, I just wanted to have the space, the time to really focus on an extensive bit of research about something that I cared very much about. Also, I sort of thought this might be the case, but it turns out that I quite like teaching. And I've done little bits and bobs of teaching before my PhD, teaching people in media skills. A long time ago, I taught English as a foreign language, but now as a graduate teaching assistant, I'm teaching on the British politics module of DPE at the moment. I've done a bit of other teaching as well, and will be next term as well on a different module. And yeah, I really enjoy the teaching. I enjoy. I like it when, an undergrad who didn't know about a particular fact or a particular idea, you can see it light up their face and they're like, oh, wow, that's cool. That makes sense of something, or it kind of opens up a new vista. And equally, when they are developing their own ideas, being able to kind of just identify the right question to ask them that kind of nudges them in the direction of discovering something for themselves, or developing an idea for themselves. That's so satisfying.
So how is the PhD process, the studying, the research, how is it all different? Or indeed, is it different to what you expected? Did you come into this with a good idea of how it would be, or is it just all surprised you and you've had to adapt?
Well, I've got quite a few friends who have done PhDs, although kind of maybe kind of like fewer than other people because I haven't been working in academia. So like most of my friends are not academics, right? But I've got a few friends who are, or at least who did PhDs, and I remember them all telling me, "Oh, there's so many things that you need to do which are not your own research, and you get really sidetracked by them, and then you just find that it comes to the end of the week, and you're like, but I've not been doing my PhD. I've been doing other stuff." Like I had been told that was the case, but nothing really prepares you for it. It's Wednesday when we're recording this, and I haven't done a single bit of research yet this week. I've only worked on other stuff relating to the PhD in one way or another, and so when and I've got a training workshop later this afternoon, so it's gonna carry on. But the second half of the week, I'm turning on my out of office. I'm possibly going to take WhatsApp off my phone, and can you believe it? Shocking idea that is. And I'm just going to be head down looking at the archives for a couple of days. But yeah, hypothetically, I knew that this was going to be a problem, but it's kind of shocking to me how true it is.
So what has helped you throughout this process of balancing your PhD with all these different activities that you still need to do?
The short answer might be I am failing at the moment to do that balance correctly. And you know what? Having this conversation is really nice because it's kind of giving me a bit of fire in my belly to start dealing with that as a problem. But I think that I'm really glad that I am doing this in my mid-30s after a decade and a half of professional experience, because if I had tried to do this aged 22 or 23 after my master's, I think I'd have screwed up quite badly, to be honest. Hopefully I'm not going to screw up badly now. But, I think I would have really struggled with how alone and how self-directed this is. Whereas now I'm like, you know what? I wrote a book by myself and I've done loads of, research projects and other work over the years without much guidance. So like, I can do this too. But ultimately, I'm not going to get overconfident about my ability to do that until I've got a good bit of research sat there on my laptop. I'm really happy with the literature review that I've written. I've been kind of fairly close to being ready for upgrade for several months now. Upgrade, for people who don't know, is like this kind of formal event that happens halfway through your PhD, where you show the work that you've done so far and information about what you're planning to do later on to academics, and they either say, yes, we think that you're on the right track and we think that you're going to be able to do your PhD, or they say, oh, we're a bit worried, you're going to have to do some extra work. So it's really just like the department checking that you're not messing up. But yeah, I have got to a fairly good place with that literature review and those plans for my research. I've really enjoyed getting stuck into the archive research and my initial conversations with potential interviewees. But I'm really conscious of the fact that I think I would have struggled terribly to do this if I didn't have the professional experience of self-directed work.
What are the challenges that you have found of doing the PhD, or maybe there's a particular challenge you thought came to the fore above all others? So, some people we've spoken to have said loneliness, some people have said distraction, some people have said all the different skills they've had to learn that they didn't realize they'd have to learn. Have you found something similar, or indeed something different?
So I think kind of I've lived in London my whole life, and I've kind of got a nice setup socially and have my partner and stuff like that. So loneliness hasn't been a problem. I'm really glad to say. I just imagine like what it would be like, I don't know, moving to London to do this PhD, and I cannot imagine how tough that would be. You know, I've got students, undergrad students, who have come over as exchange students and they've never been to London before, and it's really tough for them. And, you know, they're like going to seminars every day and whatever, so they are meeting people. But yeah, I can imagine that is really hard. Distraction, well, yeah, as I've said, I am definitely suffering from distraction quite a lot. And I think it's always tempting, you know, to like do during your supposed work time during the day all of those little bits of like life admin that you need to get done. Like, you know, I'm supposed to do my tax return very, very soon. And I often find myself thinking on a weekday afternoon, oh, I'm tired and my brain's not working. Maybe I'll just like go do my emails or my, you know, buy some Christmas presents or whatever. I'm very easily distracted like that. But kind of, I think a lot of the challenges are intellectual ones. You know, I'm definitely having to learn new skills. I've never been a historian formally, right? You know, I wrote a history book and I've made history documentaries, but I've never studied history academically, other than the history of political thought, which is quite a different kind of thing, which, as in, that was like part of my undergrad. And I have definitely struggled with the kind of openness and flexibility of historical methodologies. As in, I think that's a really good thing about historical methodologies, a really powerful thing that allows you to explore aspects of human experience that other methodologies and approaches kind of necessarily have to ignore. But it also means that, like, you do ultimately have to like pin yourself down. You do ultimately have to commit to a particular approach, and the very openness and flexibility of historical methodologies makes that a slightly difficult thing to do. And I think, you know, you're not kind of being told by anybody exactly what to do and how to do that. And I think that's probably been my biggest intellectual challenge, and it's one that I haven't totally solved yet.
So, given all these challenges and your individual experience, what advice would you give for someone who's thinking about applying for a PhD?
Everybody is different, so I think in a way I just have to say what I did and which worked for me, and I think it's probably the right approach for most people, which is apply to research something that you're definitely really interested in. You know, I talked earlier about making this Venn diagram of like kind of new Labour and climate change and the shift towards interventionism in the global and UK economies, which are sort of like three things that I'm super interested in. And in the middle of that was what I ended up doing a PhD on. And also kind of, because I had worked for the Labour Party, I've got access to particular kinds of interviewees, and I know the historical background and stuff like that. And I think that approach, which is in a sense like very pragmatic, right? It actually really worked for me, because it did help me identify something that, yeah, I am super interested in. But after that, you then have to do quite a lot of reading in order to make sure that what you're thinking about studying has not already been researched, right? There needs to be a gap in the academic literature. And I'm I guess, I'm lucky in a sense, or it by the very nature of what I'm doing, which is history of very recent events, there hasn't been much time for historians to look at them, right? And the archive material is only just becoming available now. So that made it kind of quite likely that there would be a gap. In addition to that, whilst political scientists have looked at some elements of what I'm looking at, they haven't looked at others. They definitely haven't had access to the archive, and they perhaps wouldn't have looked at it anyway. And in addition to that, the kind of early accounts of New Labour, mostly written by journalists, but some of them written by kind of historians and political scientists, which are very interview-based, maybe not kind of officially or technically oral historian work, but, definitely using some of the same techniques as oral historians would use. They really ignored energy, and they really ignored climate. They focused instead on the things that kind of New Labour was famous for, like public service reform and the war in Iraq and the big debates between Tony Blair and Gordon Brown and Tony Blair's putting down the Labour left. And so there's that was another thing that created this gap, which I'm trying to fill with the PhD. But yeah, there is absolutely there's no shortcut. You kind of just have to do the reading. Sorry.
And what's it like being a part of a PhD community? What is that like? What's the experience like?
So, because I'm like coming to this a little bit older than everyone else, I probably do a bit, and also, like everyone else is like a political scientist or an economist, and they're doing loads of data stuff that I don't understand. I'm probably a little bit kind of to the side of a lot of the PhD community here at King's, but it's really lovely, like having a chat with people in, we've got like a room with lots of computers that we can use in the department, and everyone's super friendly. And, yesterday I was sitting next to, in that computer room, I was sitting next to a PhD candidate who's just begun. She began a couple of months ago. Her PhD, and previously she was in a master's module that I kind of went to speak to last year to kind of tell them a bit about my research. So we kind of very slightly know each other, and I just asked her how she was doing, and she was expressing some concerns about the research she's doing and kind of the archive research that she's trying to do. And, I was able to say to her, oh, look, you can go ask this person who might have some specialist knowledge about it. And here's how to use this particular archive catalogue. And, by no means am I certain that that's going to have solved her issue. But, there are lots of people around who might have the answers to your questions, and you're only going to find out if you have a nice little chat with them in the department. So I think that is what a PhD community can provide. And even if it's just like seeing the same people in the PhD dissertation room at the Morn Library every day, and we sort of, give each other a nod and a smile and occasionally ask sympathetic questions about each other's work. That's a really nice thing, and it kind of reminds you that other people are having similar experiences to yourself.
Fantastic. And that brings an end to today's episode. I'd like to thank Richard for sharing his thoughts and insights for this episode, and I'd like to thank Miguel for his able co-hosting. Of course, thanks also to you, our listeners, for taking the time to tune in. We can't believe you've come back for a third series, and we look forward to welcoming you again soon for our next episode. Take care.